The rain fell in heavy sheets across the massive hangar bay of the Imperial Dreadnought, Crimson Talon. Water streamed through the damaged roof panels, creating rivers that flowed between the towering war machines and fighter craft that filled the space. Emergency repairs were still ongoing from the recent battle with the Void Hunters, and many sections remained exposed to the elements of the planet below. Empress Cythera moved through the hangar with fluid grace, her massive dragon form casting long shadows in the dim emergency lighting. Her scales, a deep crimson that seemed to absorb light itself, rippled with each powerful step. At nearly 40 feet in length, she was smaller than her ancestors, but no less imposing. The war had taken its toll on all dragons, forcing them to evolve, to adapt, to become more than just the ancient beasts of legend. She had come to inspect the repairs personally. Too many ships had been lost to mechanical failures lately, and she refused to lose more of her people to preventable disasters. The dragons were proud, but they were not foolish. They had learned to value those who could keep their war machines functioning, regardless of species. As she moved between the towering mechs and fighters, something caught her attention. A sound that didn't belong. Not the rhythmic hammering of repairs, not the hiss of welders or the shouts of work crews. Something else entirely. The sound of eating. Cythera's enhanced hearing directed her toward the source. In the far corner of the hangar, partially hidden behind a damaged interceptor, she found him, the human mechanic assigned to her personal squadron. Marcus Chen, according to his service record, a small creature by dragon standards, barely 6 feet tall, sitting cross-legged on the wet hangar floor with his back against the fighter's landing gear. Rain poured down on him through a particularly large gap in the roof. His work coveralls were soaked through, his dark hair plastered to his head. Water dripped from his nose and chin. And yet, he sat there calmly, methodically eating what appeared to be a simple field ration from a metal container. Cythera remained perfectly still, watching. The human seemed completely unaware of her presence, which was remarkable in itself. Few beings failed to notice when an apex predator was nearby. Either he was incredibly brave, incredibly stupid, or incredibly focused on something else entirely. Marcus took another spoonful of what looked like some kind of brown paste. His movements were precise, economical. He chewed slowly, deliberately, as if savoring every bite. The rain continued to pour down on him, but he showed no sign of seeking shelter, no sign of discomfort, no sign of hurry. This puzzled Cythera more than she cared to admit. In her experience, most species sought comfort when possible. They avoided discomfort, pain, inconvenience. It was logical. It was survival instinct. Yet this human sat in a cold rain, eating basic rations, and seemed completely at peace. She had dealt with humans for several cycles now, ever since the alliance was formed. They were useful creatures, surprisingly adaptable and innovative when it came to technology and warfare. But they were also soft, in her opinion. They required elaborate life support systems, constant feeding, protection from temperature extremes. They complained frequently and required motivation to perform at their best. This one was different. Marcus finished his meal and carefully sealed the empty container. He pulled a small cloth from his pocket and wiped the spoon clean before storing it in a small kit. Every movement was precise, practiced. He had clearly done this many times before. Only then did he seem to notice her presence. The human looked up, meeting her gaze without flinching. Most beings, even other dragons, showed some reaction when confronted with her full attention. Fear, respect, intimidation, something. Marcus simply nodded politely. "Empress," he said in the common trade language, his voice steady despite the rain. "I wasn't expecting an inspection tonight." "I was not conducting an inspection," Cythera replied, her mental voice projecting directly into his mind as was the dragon custom. I was investigating an irregularity. Marcus tilted his head slightly, genuinely curious. What kind of irregularity? You are eating in the rain. A small smile crossed the human's features. Yes, ma'am, I am. Explain. Marcus stood slowly, water streaming from his coveralls. He was indeed small compared to her, but he didn't seem diminished by the comparison. It's complicated, Empress, but if you really want to know... He gestured toward a nearby workstation where several dragon technicians were huddled under makeshift shelters, trying to stay dry while they worked. Your people are excellent engineers and warriors, but they don't like getting wet. Understandable, since their scales can develop corrosion issues in certain atmospheric conditions. Cythera followed his gaze. It was true that dragons preferred to avoid unnecessary exposure to moisture, though she hadn't really thought about it in practical terms. The work needs to be done, Marcus continued. Fighter 7 has a faulty stabilizer that's been causing pilot fatigue. If we don't fix it tonight, Squadron Leader Vex will be flying a compromised bird tomorrow. That puts him and his wingman at risk. There are covered work areas, Cythera pointed out. All occupied with higher priority repairs, Marcus replied. 3 destroyers, 2 cruisers, and a medical frigate all came back with critical damage. Those take precedence over fighter maintenance. This was logical. Cythera appreciated logic. But it still didn't explain his behavior. You could wait until tomorrow. Request proper workspace allocation. Marcus shook his head, sending water droplets flying. Tomorrow we might be in combat again. That fighter needs to be ready now, not when convenient. You could have requested that I order workspace reallocated to your needs. I could have, Marcus agreed, but that would mean pulling resources from those capital ship repairs, delaying work that might save hundreds of lives to make my job a little more comfortable. That doesn't seem right. Cythera found herself genuinely surprised. This was not how she expected a human to think. In her experience, most beings would choose personal comfort over abstract duty, especially when no one was watching. Yet this human had made the opposite choice. But why eat here? She pressed. Why not take your meal in dry quarters and return to work afterward? Marcus looked down at his empty food container, then back up at her. For the first time, she saw something beyond simple professionalism in his expression. Something deeper and more complex. That's the complicated part, Empress. You see, I have a tradition. Something I've been doing for a long time now. Explain this tradition. Marcus walked over to the damaged fighter and ran his hand along its hull. I eat 1 meal a day in whatever conditions my work requires. If I'm working in vacuum, I eat in my suit. If I'm working in heat, I eat somewhere hot. If I'm working in the rain, he gestured upward at the leaking roof. I eat in the rain. What is the purpose of this tradition? Solidarity, Marcus said simply. The pilots who fly these birds face all kinds of conditions. Heat, cold, vacuum, hostile atmospheres. If I'm going to maintain their aircraft, if I'm going to be responsible for their lives, then I should understand what they're dealing with. At least a little bit. Cythera considered this. It was illogical from an efficiency standpoint. The human's comfort level had no direct impact on his technical abilities. And yet, there was something in his explanation that resonated with her warrior's mind. You believe this makes you better at your function? I believe it makes me remember what my function really is, Marcus corrected. It's not just fixing machines. It's not just following technical manuals and maintenance schedules. It's making sure that when someone climbs into one of these fighters, everything I've touched works exactly the way it's supposed to work. Every time. Without fail. He paused, watching rain drip from the fighter's wing. The day I start thinking of these as just machines instead of lifelines is the day I should find a different job. Cythera found herself studying the human with new interest. In her culture, warriors were respected for their courage in battle, their skill with weapons, their tactical brilliance. But this human was claiming that maintenance work, traditionally seen as support function, was also a form of warriorship. "You consider yourself a warrior?" she asked. Marcus smiled again, but this time there was something sad in the expression. "No, ma'am. I'm not brave enough to fly into combat. I'm not strong enough to fight in boarding actions. I'm not smart enough to command fleets or plan campaigns." He looked directly into her massive eyes. "But I can make sure the warriors have tools that won't fail them. And if eating a little rain now and then helps me remember how important that is, then it's a small price to pay." The hangar fell silent except for the steady drumming of rain on metal. Cythera realized she was witnessing something she had never expected to see from a human. Not just dedication to duty, but a philosophy of service that transcended personal comfort or recognition. Most support personnel, in her experience, viewed their work as transactional. They provided services in exchange for compensation and protection. This human seemed to view his work as something approaching a sacred trust. "How long have you maintained this tradition?" she asked. 15 years, Marcus replied without hesitation. "Since my first deployment." "And in all that time, have you ever had a mechanical failure result in pilot death?" Marcus's expression grew even more serious. "No, ma'am, not on my watch. And if I have anything to say about it, not ever." Cythera felt something stir within her that she couldn't quite identify. Respect, perhaps. Recognition of a kindred spirit. This human might not breathe fire or command fleets, but he understood honor in a way that many of her own species seemed to have forgotten. "Continue your work," she said finally. "I will ensure you have whatever resources you require." As she turned to leave, Marcus called after her. "Empress? Thank you for asking. Most people just think I'm eccentric." Cythera paused. "Perhaps they simply do not understand what they are seeing." She moved away through the hangar, but found herself thinking about the small human sitting in the rain, eating his simple meal with the gravity of a religious ritual. There was more to this story, she realized. More to this human than she had initially understood. And for reasons she couldn't quite explain, she found herself wanting to know what that story was. 3 days later, Cythera found herself returning to the hangar during the evening shift. She told herself it was routine inspection, but the truth was more complex. The human's dedication had lodged itself in her mind like a splinter, impossible to ignore. The repairs from the last battle were nearly complete, but new damage had arrived that morning. A patrol squadron had limped back from the outer system, their fighters scarred by Void Hunter energy weapons. 2 pilots hadn't made it back at all. She found Marcus exactly where she expected him to be. This time, he was working beneath Fighter 12, its entire underside opened up like a dissected creature. Cables and components hung down like mechanical organs, and Marcus moved between them with practiced precision. Above him, rain still dripped through damaged roof panels, but he seemed oblivious to the water that occasionally splashed on his work. "The environmental controls in this section still require repair," Cythera observed as she approached. Marcus glanced up from his work. "Yes, ma'am. Should be fixed by tomorrow according to the repair schedule. Yet you continue to work here." "The bird needs attention now." Marcus gestured to the exposed systems above him. "Primary life support took a hit. Backup oxygen cycling isn't functioning properly. If this pilot has to make an emergency atmospheric exit, the system might not keep him alive long enough for rescue." Cythera studied the damaged fighter. She had read the after-action reports. This particular aircraft had taken heavy fire while covering the withdrawal of a damaged transport full of civilians. The pilot had stayed in the fight well past the point of safety, buying precious seconds for the evacuation. "Pilot Officer Keth requested immediate replacement of his aircraft," she said. "He did." Marcus pulled himself out from under the fighter and wiped his hands on an oil-stained rag. I told him this bird could be restored to full capability within 2 days. A replacement would be immediate. A replacement would mean sending this fighter to the scrap yards. Marcus's tone remained respectful, but there was steel underneath. This aircraft has been in service for 12 years. It has participated in 47 combat missions. It has never failed to bring its pilot home. He looked up at the scarred hull. Fighter 12 has a reputation. The pilots call it lucky. They request it specifically for dangerous missions. It's not just a machine to them anymore, it's a talisman, a symbol. Cythera had heard of this phenomenon among pilots. Humans, she had learned, formed emotional attachments to their equipment that went far beyond mere functionality. Dragons found this trait puzzling, but not entirely without merit. You believe the psychological effect justifies the additional labor investment? I believe Pilot Officer Keth earned the right to fly Lucky again, Marcus replied. He stayed in that fight until his engines were failing and his weapons were empty. He saved 300 civilian lives. Many pilots have performed admirably. You do not personally restore all their aircraft. Marcus set down his tools and looked directly at her. For a moment, she saw something in his expression that went beyond professional dedication, something personal. Keth is 19 years old, Empress. This was his first real combat mission. When he landed, he was shaking so hard he couldn't unbuckle his restraints. But he stayed in that fight when others might have broken off. He's got the heart of a warrior, but he's still just a kid who's scared and far from home. The human paused, water dripping from his hair. If I can give him back his lucky bird, maybe it'll help him feel a little less alone out there. Cythera found herself studying Marcus with growing fascination. This went beyond duty or even honor. This was something approaching parental instinct, directed toward individuals he barely knew. You have no children of your own, she said. It wasn't a question. She had reviewed his personnel file. Marcus's expression flickered for just a moment. No, ma'am. Never had the chance. Yet you show protective instincts toward these pilots. They're all someone's children, Marcus said quietly. And they're a long way from home, fighting a war that most of them don't really understand. The least I can do is make sure their equipment doesn't let them down. Cythera moved closer, her massive head lowering until she was at the human's eye level. Tell me about your tradition. The complete story. Marcus hesitated, his hands absently fidgeting with his tools. It's not very interesting, Empress. Indulge me. For a long moment, the only sound was the steady dripping of rain on metal. Then Marcus sighed and sat down on an equipment crate, his shoulders sagging slightly. I started my career on a frontier colony, he began. Agricultural world called New Harmony. Peaceful place. The kind of world where the biggest excitement was usually equipment breakdowns during harvest season. Cythera settled into a more comfortable position, wrapping her tail around herself. This had the feeling of a story that required patience. I was young, maybe 22, fresh out of technical training, thought I knew everything there was to know about maintaining atmospheric fighters. Got assigned to a small garrison force, maybe 2 squadrons worth of birds, easy duty. Or so I thought. Marcus looked down at his hands. The Void Hunters found us during the first wave of expansion. This was before the Alliance, before any of us really understood what we were dealing with. The attack came without warning in the middle of harvest season. You were not prepared for combat operations. Nobody was. The fighters we had were patrol craft, designed for search and rescue operations. Light armor, minimal weapons, but they were what we had. Marcus stood and walked to the damaged fighter, running his hand along a patched section of hull. The pilots were mostly kids, recent academy graduates pulling frontier duty, green as grass but willing to fight. They had to be. There was nowhere to retreat to. Cythera remained silent, sensing that interruption would break whatever spell was allowing the human to share this story. The evacuation began immediately, but it was going to take time. Hours to get all the civilians off-world. So the pilots went up in those little patrol birds to buy time. Marcus's voice grew quieter. They held the line for 6 hours against odds that should have been impossible. But you were not flying. You were maintaining their aircraft. I was trying to keep them flying, Marcus corrected. Every time a bird came back, it was shot to hell. Engines overheating, weapons systems failing, hull breaches, hydraulic leaks. I had minutes, sometimes seconds, to get them back in the air. He gestured toward his simple meal kit, still sitting nearby. I was working so hard I forgot to eat for the first 8 hours. By the time I remembered, the only safe place to grab food was the hangar itself. So I ate standing up between repairs, listening to the radio chatter from the fighting. Sithara began to understand. You heard the pilots in combat. I heard everything. Their fear, their courage, their desperation. I heard them calling out hits and damage reports. I heard them covering for each other when someone's bird was failing. Marcus's hands clenched into fists. And I heard them die. The hangar fell silent except for the rain. 3 pilots didn't make it home that day. Their fighters were simply too damaged to keep flying. Systems I had worked on, components I had certified as functional, they failed when those kids needed them most. Marcus turned to face her, and Sithara saw a pain in his eyes that was deeper than simple guilt. The official inquiry cleared me of any wrongdoing. The failures were due to battle damage, not maintenance issues. But that didn't change the fact that 3 families lost their children, and I was the last person to touch the systems that might have saved them. You blame yourself for combat losses. I blamed myself for not being good enough, Marcus replied, for not understanding what my real job was. I thought I was just fixing machines. But those machines carried people, real people with families and dreams and futures. He walked back to his tools, picking them up with hands that were perfectly steady despite the emotion in his voice. So I made a promise. Every day, for at least one meal, I would put myself in the same conditions as the people who depended on my work. If they were flying in storms, I would eat in storms. If they were fighting in heat, I would eat in heat. If they were dealing with equipment failures in hostile environments, I would remind myself what that felt like. You sought to share their discomfort. I sought to remember that comfort is a luxury they can't afford, Marcus said. Every time I'm tempted to cut a corner, to accept good enough instead of perfect, I remember what it feels like to depend on equipment in hostile conditions. Sithara studied the human with new understanding. This ritual wasn't about solidarity in any abstract sense. It was about penance, about maintaining a connection to the consequences of his work. And in the 15 years since, you have never lost a pilot to mechanical failure. No, ma'am, not one. Marcus began gathering his tools. And if I have anything to say about it, not ever. Sithara felt something stirring within her that she hadn't experienced in many years. Recognition of true honor, perhaps. Or simply respect for someone who understood the weight of responsibility. Your tradition honors the fallen, she said finally. Marcus paused in his work. It honors everyone who climbs into these birds trusting that they'll work when needed. Fallen, living, and not yet born. As Sithara prepared to leave, she found herself thinking about the human story. 3 pilots lost to insufficient preparation, and a lifetime of dedication born from that failure. It explained his precision, his attention to detail, his willingness to endure discomfort in service of his work, but it also raised questions that she wasn't sure she wanted answered. Questions about what would happen if, despite all his care and dedication, he lost someone again. What would that do to a man who had built his entire identity around preventing such losses? That question would haunt her dreams for the next 2 days, until events forced an answer she wasn't prepared to hear. The alarm klaxons shattered the pre-dawn quiet of the Crimson Talon. Emergency lights bathed the corridors in red as crew members rushed to battle stations. The Void Hunters had returned in force, and this time they had brought something new, something that had already destroyed 2 patrol groups before anyone realized what they were facing. Sathara burst into the main hangar to find controlled chaos. Pilots were running toward their fighters while ground crews performed final system checks. The air crackled with urgency and barely controlled fear. She found Marcus exactly where she expected him to be, but something was wrong. Instead of his usual calm precision, he moved with sharp, almost frantic movements. His hands shook as he sealed an access panel on Fighter 7. "Report!" she commanded as she approached. Marcus looked up and she saw something in his eyes she had never seen before. Terror, not for himself, but for something far worse. "It's the new Void Hunter weapons," he said, his voice tight with stress. "They're not just energy weapons anymore. They're doing something to our electronics, causing cascade failures in flight systems." Sathara's blood went cold. Electronic warfare was something they had prepared for, but cascade failures were different. They could turn any system into a trap, causing multiple failures that fed on each other until entire aircraft simply stopped functioning. "What is the extent of the damage?" "Patrol Group 7 was completely lost," Marcus replied, his hands never stopping their work even as he spoke. "All 6 birds just died in space. No explosions, no enemy fire, just complete system shutdown." "And Patrol Group 3? 2 survivors out of 8. The pilots reported that their fighters started failing piece by piece. Life support, navigation, weapons, engines. In sequence, like something was eating the systems from inside." Sathara processed this information with growing dread. If the Void Hunters could disable their fighters without firing a shot, the war was over. "But you believe you can counter this?" Marcus paused in his work, and when he looked at her, she saw something that went beyond fear. She saw a man watching his worst nightmare come true. "I've been working for the past 6 hours," he said quietly. "I think I can install hardened circuits that will break the cascade effect. Isolated systems that can keep life support and basic flight controls functioning even if everything else fails." "But," Marcus gestured toward the rows of fighters being prepared for launch, "there's no time to test it properly, no time to verify that the modifications work, no time to make sure I haven't introduced new failure points." Sathara understood. This was exactly the scenario that haunted the humans' nightmares. Being forced to send pilots into danger with untested equipment, with no guarantee that his work would keep them alive. "What is your confidence level in these modifications?" "Honestly, maybe 60%. Marcus's voice cracked slightly. "In normal circumstances, I wouldn't certify these birds for training flights, let alone combat. But if we don't launch in the next 20 minutes, the Void Hunters will be in bombardment range of the civilian evacuation ships." The sound of fighter engines starting filled the hangar. Pilots were climbing into cockpits, depending on systems that Marcus wasn't sure would work. Depending on him. "There has to be another way," he said, and Sathara heard desperation in his voice. "Some other solution that doesn't require gambling with their lives." "But there is not," Sathara said gently. "This is war, Marcus. Sometimes there are no safe choices." Marcus stood frozen, his toolkit in his hands, watching as Fighter 7's pilot sealed her cockpit. Pilot Officer Keth in Lucky, the kid he had worked so hard to protect. Lieutenant Vex in Fighter 3, a veteran with a family waiting at home, all of them trusting that the humans' work would keep them alive. 15 years, Marcus whispered. 15 years without losing anyone to mechanical failure. And now? "Now you face the test that all warriors must eventually face," Sathara said. "The moment when doing your best is not enough. When the choice is between probable failure and certain defeat." She lowered her massive head until she was at eye level with the small human. "Do you know what I learned about humans during our first battles together?" Marcus looked at her, confusion replacing some of the fear in his expression. "I learned that humans are not actually the fragile creatures they appear to be," Cythera continued. "Yes, you require life support. Yes, you are physically small compared to most species. But you possess something that larger, stronger beings often lack." "What's that?" "The ability to do what must be done, even when you are terrified of the consequences." Cythera's mental voice carried absolute conviction. "That is why humans make such exceptional warriors. Not because you are fearless, but because you act despite fear." Marcus looked out at the fighters, their engines now warming for launch. "But what if I'm wrong? What if the modifications fail? What if I send them out there to die?" "Then you will carry that burden, as warriors have always done." Cythera's tone remained gentle but firm. "But if you do nothing, they die anyway, along with everyone on those evacuation ships." Marcus closed his eyes for a long moment. When he opened them, something had changed. The terror was still there, but it was balanced now by something else. Resolve. "Fighter 7 to base," came Keth's voice over the comm system. "Ready for launch clearance." Marcus picked up his comm unit. "Fighter 7, this is Chen. I need you to listen carefully. Your bird has been modified with experimental systems. If you start seeing cascade failures, hit the emergency isolation switch I installed under your left console. It should maintain life support and basic flight controls." "Understood, Chen." "Thanks for keeping Lucky flying." More pilots checked in, each receiving the same warning about the experimental modifications. None of them hesitated. None of them questioned the humans' work or demanded guarantees. They simply acknowledged the information and prepared to launch. Marcus watched the first fighter lift off, then the second. His hands clenched so tightly around his tools that his knuckles went white. "How do you bear it?" he asked Cythera quietly. "Sending people into danger, knowing they might not come back?" "By remembering why they choose to go," she replied, "and by honoring their choice with everything I am." The battle lasted 4 hours. From the hangar, they listened to radio chatter as the fighters engaged the Void Hunters. They heard the first reports of cascade failures starting, then the pilots activating Marcus's emergency systems. They heard confirmed kills as the fighters, running on basic systems but still flying, pressed home their attacks. 3 fighters were lost to enemy fire, but not one was lost to system failure. When the surviving pilots returned, Marcus was waiting in the hangar. As each fighter touched down, he was there to inspect the emergency systems, to verify that his modifications had worked as intended. Pilot Officer Keth was the last to land. As he climbed out of Lucky's cockpit, he walked directly to Marcus. "Chen, I don't know what magic you worked on this bird, but when everything else died, your backup systems kept me alive long enough to get home." Marcus nodded, unable to speak. Around the hangar, other pilots were approaching, offering similar thanks. The emergency modifications had worked. Not perfectly, not without risk, but they had worked. Later, after the post-flight inspections were complete and the pilots had been debriefed, Cythera found Marcus sitting alone in his usual spot. But this time, he wasn't eating. He was simply staring at the empty food container in his hands. "The mission was successful," she observed. "This time." Marcus's voice was hollow. "But what about next time? What about the time after that?" Cythera studied the human carefully. Something in his posture, his tone, suggested that victory had not brought the relief she expected. "Explain your concern." Marcus looked up at her, and she saw that the terror from earlier had been replaced by something else, something sadder and more profound. "Do you know how long it's been since I've eaten a meal somewhere comfortable?" he asked. "Since I've sat in a warm, dry place and just enjoyed food?" 15 years, Cythera replied, remembering his earlier story. 15 years of rain and cold and heat and everything else. 15 years of reminding myself every day what the pilots face. 15 years of carrying the weight of other people's lives with every meal. Marcus set down the food container. Today I saved lives by gambling with experimental equipment. Tomorrow there will be some other crisis, some other impossible choice, and the day after that, another one. This troubles you? It breaks my heart, Marcus said quietly. Not because I regret my choices, not because I want to quit, but because I finally understand something I've been hiding from myself all these years. What is that? Marcus looked around the hangar at the fighters being repaired for tomorrow's missions, at the scorch marks from today's battle. This never ends. There will always be another war, another crisis, another group of young people who need someone to keep their equipment working. And there will always be someone like me, eating cold rations in uncomfortable places, carrying the weight of other people's survival. He paused, his voice becoming even quieter. The tradition I started to honor the fallen has become a prison. I can't stop now, even if I wanted to. Because the moment I start thinking of my own comfort, the moment I stop feeling the weight of every meal, someone might die because I got complacent. Cythera felt something she had never experienced before. She was witnessing the moment when a human soul broke not from failure, but from the sheer weight of continuous success, the burden of being indispensable. You wish to be relieved of this responsibility. I wish I could trust someone else to carry it, Marcus corrected. But I can't, because I know what failure costs, and I can't risk it happening again. So you will continue. Marcus picked up his meal kit and began packing it away with the same precision he brought to everything else. I'll continue. Not because I want to, but because it's who I am now. The man who eats in the rain so that pilots come home alive. As he walked away toward tomorrow's repairs, Cythera understood something profound about humans that had eluded her until now. Their greatest strength wasn't their adaptability, or their innovation, or their courage in battle. It was their willingness to sacrifice their own happiness for the safety of others, even when no one asked them to, even when no one would blame them for choosing differently. Marcus Chen would eat in uncomfortable places for the rest of his life, carrying the weight of other people's survival, not because he had to, but because he couldn't bear to do otherwise. That, Cythera realized, was what made humans truly exceptional, and heartbreaking, and worthy of the greatest honor a dragon empress could offer. From that day forward, whenever the rain fell in the hangar, Cythera would find the human at his work, and sometimes, just sometimes, she would settle nearby and keep him company in the storm. It was the least she could do for someone who had chosen to carry the weight of the world, one meal at a time.